My father's business partner stopped mid-handshake and stared at me across the ballroom like he'd seen a ghost. "Wait," he said, lowering his voice so only the people near us could hear. "Aren't you the one who—" My mother's hand clamped around my wrist before he could finish the sentence, her nails digging into my skin through the cheap blazer I'd worn specifically because it was the kind of thing she expected me to own. "She's just my assistant," my mother cut in, flashing her brightest country club smile. "Helps out around the office, filing coffee runs, that sort of thing." My father chuckled into his scotch. "We keep telling her to find a real career, but you know how it is." The whole table went quiet. 12 place settings of cut crystal and white linen, and 20 pairs of eyes drifted toward me, the daughter in the discount blazer who apparently couldn't hold down a real job at 31 years old. My name is Vivian, and at that exact moment I owned 40% of the man's company. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without understanding my family first. I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, in a house with a circular driveway and a mother who treated appearances the way other people treat religion, with total, unblinking devotion. My father, Gregory, ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm that he'd inherited from his own father, and my mother, Patricia, had never worked a day in her life unless you count chairing the spring gala for the Historical Society. They had 2 daughters. My younger sister, Brooke, was 26, blonde, effortlessly photogenic, and from the moment she could walk, she was treated like the family's crown jewel. I was the older one, the quieter one, the one who asked too many questions and didn't smile in family photos the way my mother liked. When I was 20, my parents made a decision that, looking back, set the entire course of my life. I had been saving for 3 years to transfer from community college into a 4-year business program, working 2 jobs on top of my classes, putting away every spare dollar into an account my father had technically co-signed when I turned 18. One August afternoon, I went to make a tuition payment and found the account nearly empty. $11,000 gone. When I called my father, his voice was calm, almost bored, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "Brooke needed it for her semester in Florence," he said. "You'll figure something out. You always do." My mother got on the phone a minute later and told me, without a trace of guilt, that family helps family, and that I could simply take out loans like everybody else. Brooke, meanwhile, posted photos of herself drinking wine on a balcony overlooking the Arno. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not in front of them anyway. I packed 2 suitcases that weekend and moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat in Bridgeport, and I never asked my parents for another dollar again. I took out the loans my mother suggested, finished my degree at night while working as a receptionist for a small property management company during the day, and I learned everything I could about commercial leasing, tenant negotiations, and acquisitions from men who assumed I was just answering phones. By 24, I understood that industry better than half the people who'd been in it for 20 years. By 28, I had quietly partnered with 2 former colleagues and started buying distressed commercial properties in towns everyone else had written off. Old mill buildings, half-empty strip malls, abandoned warehouses near rail lines. We renovated, we leased, we sold, we reinvested. Within 3 years, our portfolio was worth more than my father's entire firm. I never told my parents any of it. Partly out of self-protection, partly, if I'm honest, out of a petty satisfaction in letting them believe whatever cruel little story made them comfortable. For 11 years, every holiday dinner, every birthday, every awkward run-in with family friends, my mother introduced me the same way. "This is our older daughter. She does something with offices, I think. We've sort of given up trying to understand it." My father would laugh along, and I would sit there in whatever modest outfit I'd chosen specifically to not invite questions, and I would say nothing, because saying something had never once worked. Brooke got engaged that spring to a man named Cole, a hedge fund associate with a square jaw and a habit of name-dropping his Wharton classmates within the first 5 minutes of meeting anyone. My parents were thrilled in a way that made it clear they considered the marriage a kind of corporate merger, 2 prominent families joining forces. The wedding was set for late October at a vineyard estate in the Hudson Valley, and my mother spent 6 months treating the engagement period like a campaign for state office. That's where the business partner comes in. Cole's father, it turned out, was a managing director at a private equity firm called Brennan Hargrove Partners, and Gregory, my father, had spent the better part of a year trying to get Brennan Hargrove interested in financing a stalled redevelopment project a mixed-use complex on a piece of land near the train station that his firm desperately needed capital for. My father was over-leveraged in ways I doubt my mother fully understood, and this engagement, this marriage had quietly become his lifeline. What none of them knew was that 18 months earlier, my partners and I had become a minority investor in Brennan Hargrove's real estate arm. I sat on an advisory committee. I had met the firm's managing partner, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Walter Hargrove, exactly twice, both times in conference rooms in Manhattan, both times under my actual professional name, Vivian Marsh, which happened to be different from the name my family used, because I'd quietly dropped my middle name and gone by my mother's maiden name professionally. A small rebellion nobody at home had ever noticed, because nobody at home had ever asked. The engagement dinner was held at a private club in the city, the kind of place with a 2-year waiting list and a dress code enforced by women in headsets. I arrived late on purpose, slipping into my seat at the far end of the table just as the appetizers came out, hoping to stay invisible for the evening. It almost worked, until Walter Hargrove walked in. He'd come as Cole's father's guest, a courtesy appearance to support the family, and he was making his way around the table shaking hands when he reached me. His face did something complicated: recognition, confusion, the polite social effort of trying to place a face out of context. "Wait," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Aren't you the one who sits on our?" That's when my mother's hand found my wrist. "She's just my assistant," she said quickly, too quickly, the kind of fast save that comes from 20 years of practice smoothing over my existence. "Helps out around the office, filing, coffee runs, that sort of thing." My father laughed, the same laugh he'd been laughing at my expense since I was 20 years old. "We keep telling her to find a real career, but you know how it is." I watched Walter's expression shift again, this time into something closer to amusement, the look of a man who has just stumbled into a much better story than the one he expected. He glanced at me, waiting, I think, to see what I would do. I gave him the smallest shake of my head, barely a movement at all, and something in his eyes settled into understanding. He let it go, for now. He took his seat 3 chairs down, and dinner continued, and my mother launched into a story about the floral arrangements she'd selected for the wedding as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I should explain why I didn't correct her on the spot. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something closer to exhaustion, the particular fatigue of having tried years earlier to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was and weren't interested in revising the picture. The first time I'd attempted to tell my mother about my work, back when I was 26 and the business was still small, she'd cut me off halfway through to ask if I'd lost weight. The second time my father had nodded along, and then, not unkindly, asked if I needed him to look over the numbers because he worried I was getting in over my head. After that, I stopped trying. It was easier, frankly, to let them have their version of me. It cost me nothing to be underestimated. Or so I told myself for a long time. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a master class in exactly how little my family thought of me. My mother called twice that month asking if I could swing by the vineyard property to help tidy up before the rehearsal dinner, since apparently the venue's cleaning crew had fallen through and someone needed to wipe down the tasting room before guests arrived. I went, because some habits from childhood don't fully die, and I spent 3 hours scrubbing wine stains off reclaimed wood tables while my mother supervised from a folding chair, sipping iced tea and reminding me not to use too much bleach near the antique fixtures. Brooke stopped by briefly to look at bridesmaid dress swatches, holding 2 nearly identical shades of sage green up to the light, completely unbothered by the fact that her older sister was on her knees, scrubbing floors 12 feet away. 3 days before the wedding, my mother called again, this time in a state of barely controlled panic. The florist had increased the final invoice by almost $4,000, citing a shortage of peonies that time of year, and my father, she said, was dealing with some cash flow timing issues related to the redevelopment project. Code I understood now, for the fact that Brennan Hargrove had not yet committed to financing it, and the wedding deposits had drained whatever reserves the family had left. She asked, in the same breezy tone she might have used to ask me to pick up dry cleaning, whether I could help out with the difference. I told her I'd see what I could do, and then I transferred $4,000 from an account she would never see the statements for, under a name she didn't recognize, through a payment platform that listed the sender only as VM Holdings. She thanked the wedding planner for working something out with the florist, and never once wondered where the money had actually come from. That was the moment something in me shifted, quietly, the way a foundation settles long before anyone notices the cracks in the wall. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was simply done absorbing the cost of my family's image while receiving none of its benefits. Done being the invisible scaffolding that kept their version of success standing upright. The night before the wedding, there was a rehearsal dinner at a restaurant downtown, an Italian place with exposed brick and a wine list longer than the menu. I sat near the end of the table again, out of habit, and watched Cole's parents hold court at the center. My father leaning in close to Cole's father, clearly working the conversation toward the redevelopment project, dropping phrases like tremendous upside and once-in-a-generation location. Walter Hargrove sat a few seats down, watching the exchange with the patient, unreadable expression of a man who has heard 1,000 pitches and learned to let people talk themselves into revealing exactly what they want. Near the end of the meal, the check arrived, nearly $450 for the family's portion of the bill, and my mother, without any preamble, slid the leather folder down the table to me. "You can get this one, can't you, sweetheart? You don't have rent like the rest of us, living in that little apartment." A small ripple of laughter went around the table, the kind people do when they're not sure if something is a joke. I looked at the folder for a long moment. I looked at my mother, who genuinely believed, after everything, that I would either be unable to pay it or would scramble in some humiliating way to cover it. I opened my wallet and placed my black card on top of the folder, the kind of card that doesn't have a limit because the bank that issued it knows exactly what's behind it. The waiter took it without comment. My mother didn't even notice the card itself, too busy turning back to compliment Cole's mother on her earrings. But Walter Hargrove noticed. I caught him watching from across the table, one eyebrow raised slightly, filing the detail away the way men like him file everything away. I paid the bill and left the restaurant without waiting for the card to come back, which in hindsight was either reckless or exactly calculated. I'm still not sure which. I told the hostess I'd swing by in the morning to collect it, walked out into the cool October evening, and stood on the sidewalk for a minute just breathing, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the absence of the urge to explain myself. The wedding day itself was, on the surface, beautiful. The vineyard sat on a hillside with views that rolled out toward the river, the leaves just past peak color, the kind of October afternoon that looks staged even when it isn't. I arrived in a navy dress I'd bought for the occasion, simple enough not to draw attention, because old habits really do die slowly. My mother gave me a once-over when I walked in and said, with what she clearly thought was generosity, "You look nice. Very put together for you." I had learned over 11 years not to react to comments like that. I just smiled and found my seat, which predictably was at a table near the back, 3 tables away from the head table where my parents sat with Cole's parents, while I was grouped with a cluster of second cousins and a family friend I'd met twice. I watched the ceremony from a distance that felt in some ways symbolic. Brooke looked genuinely happy, and I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where I resented my sister so much as I resented the system that had made her happiness contingent on my erasure. Cole looked nervous in the way grooms are supposed to look nervous. My father walked Brooke down the aisle with visible pride, the kind of pride he had never once directed at me, not for the business degree I'd finished at night while working full-time, not for anything. The reception moved into the main hall as the sun went down, string lights strung between exposed beams, a band playing something low and pleasant while servers circulated with past appetizers. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and doing what I'd done at every family event for over a decade, making myself small and waiting for an acceptable hour to leave, when Walter Hargrove approached. "Vivian," he said, using my actual name, the one almost no one in that room had used to address me directly in years. I have to say, I spent most of this week trying to figure out if I'd imagined the resemblance. I hadn't. I set my glass down. "I figured you'd put it together eventually. Your mother introduced you as her assistant," he said, not unkindly, more curious than anything. "Filing and coffee, I believe, were the words." "That's been the official story for about 11 years, I said. He studied me for a moment, the same patient expression he'd had at the rehearsal dinner. "I sat across from your father for 40 minutes tonight while he pitched me on financing his redevelopment project. He mentioned twice that family is everything to him, that he'd do anything for his daughters." He paused. I assume he doesn't know which daughter he was sitting 20 feet away from owns 40% of the firm he's currently asking to bail him out. I didn't answer right away. Somewhere across the room, my mother was laughing loudly at something Cole's mother had said, her hand resting on my father's arm in that performative, photographable way she had perfected over 30 years of marriage. Brooke and Cole were dancing their first dance, swaying slowly under the string lights, everyone's phones raised to capture it. No, I finally said. He doesn't. Do you want him to? It was a fair question, and I didn't have an immediate answer, because some part of me, even after everything, still flinched at the idea of forcing a confrontation in the middle of my sister's wedding. But another part of me, the part that had scrubbed wine stains off a tasting room floor 3 days earlier, while my mother sipped iced tea 12 feet away, the part that had quietly wired $4,000 under a name they'd never bothered to ask about, the part that had handed over a black card at dinner and watched no one even glance at it twice, that part of me was tired of protecting people who had never once protected me. Let me think about it, I said. I didn't have to think for very long. 40 minutes later, my father found me near the edge of the dance floor. His face slightly flushed from champagne, his tone the particular warm, persuasive register he used when he wanted something. Vivian, sweetheart, I need a favor, he said, and I almost laughed, because in 11 years he had never once called me sweetheart without wanting something attached to it. Walter Hargrove mentioned you two spoke earlier. I don't know what that was about, but I need you to do something for me. There's a folder in my car, financial projections for the redevelopment. If you could just bring it in, hand it to him discreetly. Maybe say a few nice things about the family, smooth things over a little. He stopped, registering my expression. What? You want me to deliver your pitch deck, I said. I want you to be useful for once, he said, and the words landed exactly the way they were meant to, a small, practiced cruelty disguised as a request. This deal matters, Vivian, more than you understand. I understand more than you think, I said. He frowned, already losing patience, already glancing past me toward the head table, calculating how much time this conversation was costing him. Just get the folder. Please. I went out to the parking lot, mostly to give myself a minute alone, and I did in fact retrieve the folder from his car, because old patterns of compliance don't disappear in a single evening, even when you've decided to stop living inside them. But instead of bringing it directly to Walter, I walked back into the hall and found my mother first, standing near the cake table fussing with the seating chart for the toasts. Mom, I said, I need to tell you something before the toasts start. She barely looked up. Can it wait? I'm trying to figure out why the Hendersons aren't at table 6. It can't, actually. Something in my voice must have registered, because she finally looked at me properly, the particular look she gave when she suspected I was about to embarrass her in public, a look I'd seen at every family dinner, every holiday, every moment I'd ever tried to talk about anything that mattered to me. What is it, Vivian? I'm not your assistant, I said. I haven't been anyone's assistant in 11 years. I own 40% of Brennan Hargrove Partners' real estate division. The firm Dad's been trying to get financing from for the past year. The firm whose managing partner you introduced me to tonight as someone who handles your filing. My mother's face went through several stages in the span of about 3 seconds, confusion, disbelief, and finally something colder, something closer to calculation. The same expression I imagine crossed her face whenever she was rapidly revising a story to her own advantage. That doesn't make sense. You clean? I haven't cleaned anyone's house since I was 23, I said. I started a property management company because you and Dad drained my college fund for Brooke's trip to Florence and told me to take out loans. I built it into something real. I never told you because every time I tried, you weren't interested, so I stopped trying. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Across the room, I saw my father approaching, drawn by whatever shift in body language he'd noticed from a distance, the same instinct that had always made him hover whenever he sensed a situation slipping outside his control. What's going on, he said, arriving beside my mother, his eyes flicking between us. Your daughter, my mother said slowly, is apparently lying about owning part of Brennan Hargrove. I'm not lying, I said, and I handed my father the folder he'd asked me to retrieve from his car. Here's your deck. You can deliver it yourself. I turned and walked toward the head table, where Walter Hargrove was sitting with his wife, sharing a quiet laugh about something unrelated to any of this. I crouched slightly beside his chair so I wouldn't have to raise my voice. I think it's time, I said. He nodded, set down his glass, and stood. He didn't make a scene of it, didn't tap a fork against a glass or call for everyone's attention the way these moments unfold in movies. He simply walked over to where my parents were standing, frozen in the particular silence of two people realizing the ground beneath them has shifted, and extended his hand to my father. "Gregory," he said pleasantly, "I have to tell you, I had a wonderful conversation with your daughter Vivian a little while ago. We go back further than you might realize. She sits on the advisory committee for our real estate division. I believe you two work in somewhat overlapping circles." My father's smile flickered and held, the way it does for men who have spent decades performing composure. "Vivian, he glanced at me, recalculating in real time. "My older daughter. Yes, brilliant girl. We're very proud." "I imagine you must be," Walter said with the faintest edge of something that wasn't quite mockery but wasn't far from it either. "It's a shame I had to find out from your wife that she's your assistant." "Filing and coffee, I believe were the words. He let that sit for a moment, watching my mother's face go pale, actually pale, the blood draining visibly from her cheeks in a way I'd never seen happen to her before, not once in 31 years. "I'll be honest with you, Gregory. I came tonight prepared to hear your pitch on the redevelopment project. But I find myself far more interested in understanding why a man would spend a year asking my firm for capital, while sitting 20 feet away from a 40% stakeholder in that same firm, introducing her to guests as the help." My father had no answer. I watched him search for one, watched the gears turn behind his eyes the way they always did when he was trying to locate the version of events that would make him look least foolish, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched him come up completely empty. "I think," Walter continued, "we'll table the financing conversation for now. I'd rather have it with Vivian directly, on terms she finds appropriate whenever she's ready." He returned to his table. The band, oblivious, kept playing. Around us, a few nearby guests who had caught fragments of the exchange were exchanging glances, the particular electric hum of a room that senses something has happened without fully understanding what. My mother stood very still, her hand pressed flat against her chest, and for once in her life she had nothing performative to say. "Vivian," she finally managed. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had taught me, more thoroughly than anyone else ever could, exactly what it felt like to be invisible inside my own family. "I tried," I said. "More than once. You weren't interested. So I built something you'd never have to understand, and I let you believe whatever made you comfortable. That was easier than the alternative." "That's not fair," my father said, finding his voice again, defensive now, retreating into the register he always used when cornered. "We didn't know. You didn't ask," I said. "There's a difference. I didn't stay for the rest of the reception. I found Brooke briefly, on her way back from the dance floor, flushed and happy and clearly unaware of what had just unfolded 40 feet away. I told her I loved her, that I was happy for her, that none of this was about ruining her night, and I meant it. Whatever existed between me and our parents had very little to do with her, and I wasn't interested in making my sister's wedding day collateral damage in a war she hadn't started. She hugged me, confused but warm, and I left before the cake was cut. I didn't speak to my parents for almost 3 weeks after that. When my mother finally called, her voice was different, smaller somehow, none of the usual brisk certainty. She asked if we could have lunch. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what version of an apology she'd settled on. We met at a quiet place near my office, the actual office, the one with my name on a small brass plaque outside a corner suite she had never once visited. She looked around when she walked in, taking in the framed acquisition announcements on the wall, the view of the harbor, the quiet competence of the staff who greeted me by name, and I watched her recalibrate in real time, the same way my father had at the wedding. She didn't apologize, not exactly, not in the direct way I might have wanted at 20, before I'd learned to stop expecting it. What she said instead was that she wished I'd told her, that she would have understood. And I let that sit without correcting it, because I'd learned there was no version of this conversation that would give me back the 11 years I'd spent being introduced as the help. My father's redevelopment project, I later heard through mutual acquaintances, eventually found financing elsewhere, at considerably less favorable terms, and his firm spent the better part of the following year working to stay solvent. I never offered to help, and he never asked, which felt, in its own quiet way, like the most honest conversation we'd had in over a decade. Brooke and I are close now, closer than we've ever been, in a relationship that finally has nothing to do with our parents' version of either of us. My mother still struggles, in small ways, to introduce me accurately at family gatherings, old habits apparently outlasting even public humiliation. But she stopped calling me her assistant. These days she just says with a kind of careful, uncertain pride, "This is my daughter, Vivian. She's in real estate." It isn't the whole truth, but it's closer than anything she managed in 11 years, and lately I've decided that's enough of a beginning.